I hate to have to start here today, but I have a sort of epidemiological gun to my head for metaphorical purposes called the Delta variant and called anti-vaxxerism. And it's just bad news about this pandemic that we just can't seem to shake. Thanks to people refusing to get vaccinated and thanks to the highly contagious Delta variant, average daily cases here in the United States are up 122% in just over 3 weeks, more than doubling in just 3 weeks, up from their bottom of about 12,000 cases a day. We had gotten down to about 12,000 cases a day. By the way, still more than the 10,000 case per day mark that Dr. Anthony Fauci established over a year ago as sort of like, we need to get below that to say it's under control. We almost got down to that. And now cases back up 122% to about 27,000 a day. This is really quick, and it's because of the rapidly spreading 60% more contagious Delta variant, combined with too many people just choosing not to get vaccinated. There's vaccines everywhere. They're coming out. You can't walk through a pharmacy without just stumbling over vaccines. And 20% of the country just not interested. And the good news is, and we'll get back to this, if you are vaccinated, you are really well protected against the Delta variant. If you are vaccinated and you get the virus in one of these, what are called breakthrough infections, you're likely not to have symptoms. And if you do have a symptomatic vaccinated case, it's likely not to be serious. You're not likely to be hospitalized. You're not likely to die. But nothing is perfect. Everything is bell curve distribution. And some vaccinated people who do everything right will get sick and they will die. And every person who chooses not to get vaccinated makes that more likely. We wondered, though, cases are up, but will deaths be up? Because with so many people vaccinated, we might see cases, but we won't see deaths go up. We said 3 weeks ago, we need 3 weeks to answer that question because deaths lag cases by 3 weeks. And sadly, the answer there is yes as well. You have to look carefully because it's still a small uptick in terms of raw numbers. But on a percentage basis, deaths are now up almost 20%. Deaths per day in the U.S. from COVID bottomed out about a week ago at 218 per day. They have ticked back up 20% to 259 per day. We have only fully vaccinated about half of the United States. If you look at vaccinations per day, you see that we are now back down to the daily vaccination levels of early January, when we had almost no vaccine availability. We're now doing a pathetic, flaccid, weak 500,000 doses a day. We have all the vaccines. You can just walk in almost anywhere, and we're only doing 500,000 doses a day. And since many of those are parts of a 2-dose regimen, we're really only completing a vaccination protocol for probably about 350,000 people per day. 0.1% of the population per day. It's humiliating, it's pathetic, and the virus is spreading. It's not some abstract thing. Oh, vaccinations are down, but it has no real impact. Cases up 122%, deaths up almost 20%. Not just happening in the US, although it's particularly bad here. Globally, cases are now back up 31% from their low. Globally, deaths are now back up about 3% from their low. Remember, deaths follow cases by 3 to 4 weeks. Nearly half of Republicans in the United States just don't want the vaccine. People in other countries are falling all over themselves to try to get the limited vaccines that are available. And in the United States, nearly half of Republicans say, nah, I don't want to go and get it. It's horrifying stuff. Dr. Eric Topol, who has been a guest on the program before, posted to his Twitter, there are places in the United States with vaccination rates as low as 15%, 15. Newton, Missouri, 16% vaccination. Douglas, 15%. Reynolds, 15%. This is unconscionable. Now, if there is any good news, we'll go back to something I mentioned at the top of the segment. It is once again the reassurance that the vaccines work really well. We can't control the fact that even as vaccinated people, we are more at risk thanks to people who refuse to get vaccinated. That we can't directly control. We can try to convince them, but we can't change the math of that. But being able to get vaccinated oneself is a big piece, because the latest numbers are that 99% of those who are currently hospitalized are unvaccinated people. So the level of protection that you can unilaterally give yourself just by going and getting vaccinated is absolutely huge. It's not perfect, but it's absolutely huge. And that's the reassuring thing. The hope would be, and this is, depending on whether you look at Pfizer or Moderna, and you look at it, there's a lot of details in this. The hope would be maybe by the end of fall, by winter, maybe not until early 2022, the vaccine that will be available will be one that is already tailored for the Delta variant. But as we know, the more it spreads, the more opportunity to mutate and to go to some new variant that the vaccine will not be tailored to. There's now talk of this Lambda variant from Australia. We don't know much about it. There's the possibility that it's even more contagious than Delta. We don't know about the mortality rate. These are all questions. And because we don't have answers to those questions, what question do we have an answer to right now? Well, the question is, how can you give yourself drastic protection and protect others? It's just you go and get vaccinated. It's that simple. So it's depressing. I'm not going to lie. It is very, very depressing, but it is where we are today. And hopefully we will be able to accelerate vaccination. I don't know what it'll take at this point. I know that a third of those who say, I don't want it, say, if it receives full approval from the FDA, I will go and get vaccinated. 1/3 of those who don't currently want the vaccine say, I will get it if it gets full authorization, full approval from the FDA. That's coming soon. So we will soon see if we are going to see that. Okay, Senate Democrats are to propose federal cannabis decriminalization. For many people, one of the top issues of the Joe Biden campaign was the full decriminalization of cannabis, of marijuana at the federal level as a starting point for hopefully eventual rescheduling, further legalization. Remember, decriminalization and legalization are two different things, and we'll talk about the impact of that actually on tomorrow's program. So it's not legalization that we're talking about, but it is still a really, really big deal. CNBC reporting, Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer proposed legislation to legalize marijuana at the federal level. The Cannabis Administration and Opportunity Act would remove marijuana from the Controlled Substances Act and introduce regulations to tax cannabis products. Now, even the article is not exactly right, because the proposal is for decriminalize, which is in the headline, but then the point says legalize. That's not actually what the proposal is. It would also expunge federal records of nonviolent cannabis offenders. This is a huge deal. This was proposed yesterday, and the idea here is start laying the groundwork to ease legislation that, while it may not, in the way that it is written, disproportionately target poor people and people of color, in practice, that's what the war on drugs has done. And we know, because we've heard from the people who were involved in the creation of the current infrastructure we have around the criminality of drugs, that was actually the goal. The war on drugs was I sort of want to say racially tinged, but that's not really strong enough. It was a racially targeted reaction to the civil rights movement that started in the late 50s and sort of made more progress during the 1960s in the United States. The proposal, the Cannabis Administration and Opportunity Act, would remove marijuana from the Controlled Substances Act and introduce regulations to cannabis products. The proposal would expunge federal records of nonviolent cannabis offenders and allow people serving time in federal prison, importantly federal, not state, for nonviolent marijuana crimes to petition a court for resentencing. The plan would also create an opportunity trust fund from new cannabis tax revenue in order to invest in programs for communities most affected by the, quote, failed war on drugs, according to a draft of the bill. Now, what is the probability of this becoming law? The plan to decriminalize marijuana will likely face a contentious battle in the Senate, as it's generally opposed by Republicans and some moderate Democrats, and has not received an endorsement from President Joe Biden. Schumer will require 60 votes including at least 10 GOP votes to pass it through the Senate. In terms of what we've seen on legalization and decriminalization so far, 37 states and D.C. have legalized medical cannabis. 18 states and D.C. have legalized recreational use, but it is still illegal under federal law. Public polling shows that nearly 70% of Americans support legalizing the drug. So there's a bunch of stories here. One story is Joe Biden going to, after what he talked about during his campaign, come out and endorse this particular bill? As many of you know, in politics, often you campaign on supporting an idea, and then when a bill is put forth that would make that idea a reality, oftentimes politicians will say, well, this particular bill as written has this problem, has that problem, and remains to be seen where Joe Biden is going to land on this particular bill. Number two, we have talked increasingly over the years about how in the United States, the policy desires of the American people as a whole often don't get made a reality. And this is for a number of different reasons. One reason is that our elected officials are far more conservative than the population at large. If you look at sort of the average political placement on the spectrum of at the federal level, senators and members of Congress, and you compare their positions on policy to those of the American people, for example, 70% support legalization, and yet we don't even know that we can get 60% of the Senate to say, yeah, I'll vote for this bill. That's one issue that we've talked about as well. So there's a number of different stories here. And we know that corporations and elites and the wealthy have outsized influence on what actually becomes law and what the legislative priorities are relative to just the average person. One stunning example of this is, of course, after the Sandy Hook school shooting during Barack Obama's presidency, which was now many years. I don't even know the number of years. It's way more. It feels way more recent than it actually is. There was like 88, 90% support for what's called universal background checks among the American people in the United States. And yet Democrats, who at the time controlled the White House, the House, and the Senate, were not able to get universal background checks made into law. And there's a ton of different reasons for why that is, and all of them corrosive to the idea of a representative democracy. But that's one example. The American people's view now on cannabis, at minimum decriminalization, is another example. Here's an opportunity. Good for Chuck Schumer for putting forth the bill, but we will see where it actually goes. On August 16th, it is the 16th. Speaking of, it feels like yesterday. It is the 16th anniversary of the David Pakman Show. And we will be doing a one-day huge membership special. 16. It's going to be related to the number 16 because it is the 16th anniversary of the show. That's on Monday, August 16th. If you would like to be notified of this historic, it's an historic and a historic opportunity to sign up for a membership, just get on my newsletter at davidpakman.com. And then Monday morning, that's Monday, August 16th, you'll get an email telling you how to sign up. Let's take a quick break. What a packed show we have for you today. Remember that our show does depend in a real way on folks like you who sign up for memberships on our website, and we do produce an extra entire show for our members. You can sign up at joinpakman.com and use the coupon code BETTER21 to get a discount if you so please. The normal prices are very, very good, but I am glad to offer an even bigger discount with the code BETTER21, which you can use at joinpakman.com. The David Pakman Show subreddit now has nearly 32,000 of our viewers and listeners subscribed and participating, and you can propose segments for the show. You can engage with other people. Please don't troll, though. We do have moderators, and we're trying to keep the trolling down to a very, very dull roar. A few posts that I do want to signal that I found interesting. A bunch of different people posting links to articles about the 30-year-old anti-vaccine nurse who got COVID and died. And I'm glad to report on it, and a lot of people have asked me to talk about it. But the glee with which some people are saying she got what she deserved, it's really tough for me to get on board with that, because I see these people as victims. These are people who fell for anti-science, right-wing propaganda. It's hard to cheer that. And the truth is, I would rather her still be alive. And even if you don't care about this one individual, think about the greater good. We would still all be better. How many people might she have spread the virus to in eventually dying from it, even if it was based on her decision not to get vaccinated because of her beliefs? We're all better off if she gets vaccinated and doesn't get sick and doesn't risk passing it to others. So whether your motivations are moral or societal or for other people or even economic, because we know of the huge economic cost, for me, I'm just not where I know some of the audience is in a sort of like total disregard and lack of empathy for this woman. Also, as far as we know, I mean, statistically, she probably has some loved ones who did get vaccinated and did do everything right, and now they suffer as a result of her death as well. So listen, I get it. At a certain point, it's personal responsibility and you have to decide, and we can't force anyone to understand or accept the science about vaccines. But I'm not where some people in the audience are in terms of the total disregard, lack of empathy, and sometimes almost glee about the fact that an anti-vax person died. I mean, that is the tragedy, right? That's what we're talking about. 99% of those who are now hospitalized are not vaccinated. This has a very real impact. But yes, an anti-vaccine nurse who was only 30 years old did get the virus and died. Another post related to vaccination about how the CPAC crowd over the weekend, we covered CPAC earlier in the week, the CPAC crowd cheered as vaccination rates were announced to not be that high. And this user pointing out that the Republican Party is really the pro-death party and saying, at this point, I don't even have any long-winded explanation beyond the title. What more needs to be said? Vaccination rates aren't meeting Joe Biden's projected goals. Yay, that hurts Biden and it helps us, the Republican Party. And it means a lot more people are going to die needlessly. And so they cheer. That was one of the most disgusting moments of CPAC, cheering the fact that there are millions of people in the United States who by choice are choosing not to protect themselves and by extension, protect the people around them from coronavirus. And as I said before, I am angry at them to some degree because it's infuriating what they're doing. They also are victims of the fact that they've fallen for stuff that's not true. They've fallen for it from the Republican Party. They've fallen for it from the so-called libertarians talking about medical freedom as if that's even remotely what this is about. They've fallen for the conspiracies. They are victims. It doesn't mean we can't be mad at them, but they are victims. And I think it's important not to forget that to some degree. Lastly, someone pointed out that what's up with David's pen? And they wrote that sometimes my hands come into the frame and I have nothing in my hands. And sometimes I've got a Sharpie in my left hand. And then sometimes I have a Sharpie in my right hand. And then sometimes it's a pen in the left hand. And then all of a sudden the pen is in my right. There is no rhyme or reason. At different points during the show, I may make a note on my extensive legal pads that I have just off screen. Sometimes I may use the Sharpie to cross something out once I've made a statement about it on the show, something I think about. There's really no rhyme or reason to it. And I apologize if it's distracting to people. Whoa, and even that noise may have been distracting to people. I am not trying to do anything other than stay on track and present to you all the information that I intend to. Join the discussion on issues ranging from importance at the bottom end about my Sharpie use all the way to the top end about people who are choosing not to get vaccinated. You can find the subreddit at davidpakman.com/Reddit. This next clip is truly a pleasure to watch, and it is exactly what I have been recommending be done when dealing with right-wing media. Engage in conversation, but get them on the record. Did Trump win or lose in 2020? Let's start there, just so we know who and what we're dealing with here. The Daily Beast reports that yesterday, during an appearance on Fox News, the day before yesterday, Texas State Representative James Talarico, a Democrat, young guy, challenged Pete Hegseth to tell his viewers that Donald Trump lost the 2020 presidential election to Joe Biden. Hegseth refused to just confirm, yes, Trump lost, which really proves the guest's point in trying to get him on the record about this. And Talarico quickly started going after Fox News. He eventually demanded, hey, Pete, say that Trump lost. Say it. Let's take a look at it. This is just fantastic.
Someone in your district that can't get identification?
You have made a lot of money personally, and you've enriched a lot of corporations with advertising by getting on here and spewing lies and conspiracy theories to folks who trust you. And so what I'm asking you to do is to tell your voters right now that Donald Trump lost the election in 2020.
At least you've resolved the lie that is Democrats are now for voter ID. It's not your show, sir, but at least you resolved the idea that Democrats are not for voter ID.
Did Donald Trump lose the election in 2020?
Real quick.
Can you answer the question? Did Donald Trump lose the election in 2020?
I'm answering questions. Don't really feel any obligation to answer anything of you.
So I think Hegseth there meant to say, I'm asking questions, not answering them. But he seems so tripped up.
Question for you?
No, it's...
See, this is Pete, the reason
my question is, why are you in Washington, D.C. and not in...
He's in Washington, D.C. because Texas Republicans threatened Texas Democrats with arrest if they didn't show up in order to prevent a quorum, in order to prevent a disgusting Texas voter suppression bill from passing. But as far as the clip goes, I just absolutely love that. Every Democratic guest should be doing that every time they appear on these networks. But David, sir, they're not being brought on to talk about whether Trump won. So it's sandbagging. It's wrong for them to do. I don't care. Make them kick you off. Make them never invite you back. If every single Democratic guest starts asking this, it's going to very quickly put them in a really awkward position. But like I've been saying, do this in every interview with Republican officials as well. When whoever on whatever channel interviews a Republican official, ask them, just for context, did Donald Trump win or lose the 2020 election? And many of them have figured out how to play coy. Many of them, you say, did Trump win the election or did Trump lose the election? And they will say, listen, Joe Biden is the president of the United States. That's what matters, because what they're avoiding answering is whether Joe Biden should be based on the election results. That's how they play coy with it. And so even asking the question, the host still is going to have to be prepared. But I think that this is an important thing to do, because at the end of the day, what's the point of interviewing people when they can't even be on the same page about basic facts? Would we trust them about any of their views on politics if they can't even acknowledge who won the 2020 election? Think about it analogously. If we did a series on space travel and I suspected a guest believed the Earth was flat, and I start the interview by saying, is the Earth flat or spherical? And they won't answer. Why would I keep talking about space travel with that person? End the interview. We can't even get to a simple foundational infrastructure about just the fundamentals of how the world works. Why would I continue talking about space travel? And similarly, in political interviews, do you accept that Donald Trump genuinely, not because of fraud, he just lost? If you don't accept that, why are we going to talk to you about your views on politics? It's a simple screening question, really nicely done by James Talarico. I hope that this becomes a trend where Democratic guests will say this to right-wing hosts, and hosts will ask Republican guests, did Trump win or did Trump lose? Answer that question before we move on. I would love to see it. And we'll have more on this strategy on the David Pakman Show Instagram, which you can find at David Pakman Show. This is crazy, but nearly 100,000 followers on the David Pakman Show Instagram. We'll take a quick break and be back with much more after this. It's great to welcome Bob Kuttner to the program today, who is co-editor of the American Prospect magazine, also chair at the Heller School for Social Policy and Management at Brandeis University. I really appreciate your time today. Thanks for being on.
Pleasure to be with you.
So I've been interested in the idea of economic nationalism for some time. And one of the, I guess, where we can maybe start is whether there is some inconsistency among some on the left on this issue, because I'm still developing sort of my sense of this, but there is a sort of global egalitarianism that I see from many who, like me, describe themselves as being on the left and progressives, that seems to stop short when it comes to, well, we should have an economy that prioritizes the American worker. We should have trade deals that are best for the United States. Is there a conflict or an inconsistency there?
Not necessarily. And I think it's really important to start out by defining what we mean. And I think economic nationalism means two different things that sometimes get conflated rather sloppily. So
good.
Let's start with that.
Please.
So if you are a Roosevelt progressive and you're not a neoliberal, and you think that capitalism is predatory, and in order to have a system that is efficient and socially just, the government has to be involved big time. A democratic government has to be involved big time in regulating capitalism. That means that you have to put limits on globalism, because if you have what we've had for the past 30 or 40 years with WTO and the use of trade deals to undercut the regulation of capitalism, you can't regulate capitalism. I mean, banks can go offshore, and we don't care whether products that we import are made with slave labor. You know the whole litany.
Sure.
So economic nationalism, in one sense of the word, simply means that we have to regulate capitalism, and we, for better or worse, is the nation state. There's no global economy. You can't regulate capitalism with the Republic of NAFTA. You have to regulate it with the United States of America, where I'm a citizen and you're a citizen.
And to some degree, is that also just the practicality of legal framework and just sort of the limits of what any one group can do? I mean, I know we have NATO, we have we have these organizations, but does it get sloppy?
Well, it's about sovereignty.
Yeah.
If you want to try and regulate capitalism, you need a degree of sovereignty, and the state is sovereign. And there is no sovereignty globally except to the extent that you have treaties. Okay.
Right.
The other kind of economic nationalism, of which Trump is the extreme example, or maybe Hitler is the more extreme example, is America first or Germany first, and screw the rest of the world. And so where it gets tricky is on the question of how you make it possible for the whole world to regulate capitalism in the interest of ordinary people. And since we don't have a global government, that means you have to have agreements, you have to have treaties. This morning's New York Times reports that the EU is going to have climate tariffs. If you try to export stuff into the EU that are made with processes and products that pollute, you're going to have to pay a tariff. Now, that's a good kind of nationalism. And Biden's talking about doing the same thing. So the tricky part, for me anyway, because I'm a third world guy as well as a New Dealer, how do you extend this so that the whole world is able to regulate predatory capitalism? And interestingly, that is what was attempted in 1944 at the Bretton Woods Conference, where the architect of that conference was John Maynard Keynes. He got a do-over. They got it wrong at the Treaty of Versailles in 1919, where he was a junior economic advisor to the British government. He quit in disgust, in protest. And then 25 years later, he was the chair of the Bretton Woods Conference, and he said, we have to orchestrate the rules of the global system so that every country gets to regulate capitalism in the interest of workers, in the interest of citizens. Now, here's the tricky part. You get down to cases. So if we think that China is predatory, we think that China violates human rights, we think that China violates the rules of the trading system where they subsidize and they dump and they steal intellectual property and all that stuff. And so we're going to have an industrial policy, and we're going to have a national security policy where certain technologies we're not going to allow China to acquire. That seems pretty sensible, to have an industrial policy. Where do you draw the line? And is that an industrial policy for the United States, or is that an industrial policy that the EU and all of the democracies are part of? And then if that's the case, who gets the business? So for instance, there are three major chip companies that are not Chinese, that make state-of-the-art chips. One's Intel, the other two are European, Ericsson and Nokia. So do you have a cartel? Do you carve up the market? Or do you say we have one set of rules for companies that play by, democratic norms and market norms, and a different set of rules for China, which doesn't play by market norms? So where it gets tricky is around the edges, where when you get down to cases. And here's Vietnam, third world country, a dictatorship, but not as nasty a dictatorship as China. And a lot of stuff gets outsourced to Vietnam by American companies. And these are very poor people who need the work. This is where it gets tricky. And so you have to have trade agreements that are very different from the kind of trade agreements that Clinton and Obama made, that have human rights in them, that have some concern for the ability of third world countries to get a foot on the ladder so that they can have decent living standards for their people, but not simply turning the world over to multinational corporations.
Yeah, and I wanted to, let's talk a little bit about trade if we can, because the concept of free trade being a net positive is rooted in some pretty traditional economic ideas of specialization and relative efficiencies of producing and exporting products. And it really goes back to a lot of that traditional economics. And at the end of the day, as you're pointing out, sometimes the best way to control conditions when it comes to labor and products and imports is you bring the supply lines domestic. But at the same time, then you're depriving, as you point out, a lot of people around the world of the ability to better themselves and better their economic situation. So how should we interpret all of that and sort of parse it?
Let me address what you said about trade being efficient, and then let me respond to the second question.
Yeah.
Well, here's a conundrum. David Ricardo, et cetera, theory of comparative advantage.
Yep.
Trade is efficient because of specialization. Okay, but hold on. We have known ever since Roosevelt, and before really, that free markets are not efficient, right? Markets price things wrong. Markets price carbon wrong. Lord Nicholas Stern said, global climate change is history's epic case of market failure.
Right.
Markets price labor wrong because corporations have the power to really exploit workers. Markets price all kinds of stuff wrong. They price housing wrong. So question, how is it that we need to have a managed form of capitalism domestically because markets price things wrong, and then somehow when you cross borders, all of a sudden markets price things right? And the answer is they don't. And this gets into power relationships. You want third world countries to be able to get jobs and gain market share, but you don't want them to exploit their workers. So let me give you an example of a trade deal that I think was a pretty good trade deal.
Yeah.
There used to be something called the multi-fiber agreement. It was a worldwide cartel for textiles and apparel. And the idea was that we're going to give every country that wants to export textile products into the United States a quota. And the economists said, this is terrible. This is a cartel. This violates the free market. And the other side of the argument was, well, if you just eliminate it, China will get everything because China will underprice everybody and all these other countries will get the short end of the stick.
Common argument.
Huh?
Commonly heard, commonly repeated, yes.
Yeah. So what they did for a while, this was in the last 2 years of Clinton when Bob Rice was Secretary of Labor and actually had some influence, they made an agreement. Cambodia was the model country. And the agreement was, if you follow International Labor Organization norms and you give workers the right to organize, we will give you additional quota slots under the multi-fiber arrangement. And so thanks to that, the labor movement got a foothold in Cambodia, and workers actually started being paid better. It didn't hurt their market share, it helped their market share. And then, of course, the Republicans come in and they just blow away the whole thing. So there's a middle ground. I guess this is my punchline.
Yeah.
There's a middle ground between absolutely free trade, which is a mirage anyway, and Trumpian economic nationalism, which is a kind of negotiated trade where you have some norms, where you have some standards, and the standards are not just a covert way of screwing the third world. And a lot of the third world diplomats have made the argument that the West is hypocritical. The West talks about the International Labor Organization, talks about labor standard. That's just protectionist. And again, you got to get down to cases. Depending on the particular rules that are negotiated, it can be protectionist, or it can be in the interest of workers everywhere. And so you have the case of the horrible Bangladesh fires, where this is a very dirt poor country, needs the job so that workers don't die in fires, but you don't do that as a covert way of depressing their market share. You've got to get down to cases. I guess that's the point.
The last thing I wanted to touch on briefly relates to the coronavirus pandemic. We've talked to economists, social psychologists, all sorts of different folks about the impacts that they see as a result of the coronavirus pandemic and what we've sort of learned from it. When it comes to an economic nationalism perspective, globalization, supply chains, et cetera, what do you see as the big takeaways from the pandemic?
Well, I think, and it's not just the pandemic. I mean, the fortunate thing about the pandemic is that it moves this center stage and gets people talking about it. So I think it demonstrated that reliance on supply chains, a lot of which are in countries who are not necessarily our friends, is risky economically and risky politically. The question is, which stuff do we want to make in the United States for what reasons? Do we want to make it in the United States for industrial policy and technological leadership and jobs reasons? Do we want to make it in the United States for national security reasons? And where do we draw the line? Take solar cells. America was once the leader in solar panels. China basically undercut America's pricing, stole a lot of technology. They're now the leader. If we take it back, try to take it back with an industrial policy, that means we're paying more money in the short run for solar panels,
right? Which
is more expensive if we're trying to get rid of carbon. So it's complicated. You cannot settle this at the level of grand theory. You have to have some basic norms. We want a positive sum game that helps American workers and also helps the third world. And then you got to get very specific.
Yeah. And often I think that missing from the conversation where we hear just this very vague and general, bring the production back home, there's very little discussion of the impact that would have on the prices of many of the things that we're talking about, as you point out with solar panels, which is a decision that could be made. I mean, the decision could be made. Here's a list of 10 areas where we believe it's worth paying more. Here's how much access would be reduced for the American people as a result of that, but we believe it's worth it.
Well, and by the way, this is what Japan and Korea and China all did at earlier stages of their economic development. I mean, a Ricardian economist would have said to the Japanese, why in the world do you want to invest in an auto industry or a steel industry or a machine tool industry? Because you can get it cheaper from the United States. And the Japanese answer was, well, it depends on what your time horizon is. If your time horizon is this year, yeah. But if your time horizon is 50 years or 100 years or 1,000 years, we want that industry in our country because that's good for our economic growth and for our jobs. So you can't just take a snapshot at a point in time and look at the China price, look at the U.S. price, and say, oh well, obviously we got to buy from China. So it really, it's tricky, it's complicated, and you got to get into the details and the particulars.
Without question, without question. We've been speaking with Bob Kuttner, who's co-editor of the American Prospect, also chair at the Heller School for Social Policy and Management at Brandeis University. I really appreciate your time today and your insights.
Thanks so much for having me.
All right, let's get into a breaking story that many in the audience will appreciate. And unfortunately, some in the audience will be furious that I'm even talking about this. There are new Kremlin papers which appear to show Vladimir Putin's plot to put Donald Trump in the White House. Important. This doesn't mean that Trump and Putin met to concoct this plan or that Trump was directly involved. The whole point is what has been said all along for people who love to say Russiagate, 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 that Russia had a preference for Trump because of the cartoonish and destabilizing nature that his presidency would have, and they worked to help him regardless of what Trump knew or participated in. Documents suggest Russia launched secret multi-agency effort to interfere in U.S. democracy. Go by what is said, not by what you imagine I am saying and want to refute. The report, Vladimir Putin personally authorized a secret spy agency operation to support a, quote, mentally unstable Donald Trump in the 2016 U.S. presidential election during a closed session of Russia's National Security Council, according to what are assessed to be leaked Kremlin documents. The key meeting took place on January 22nd, 2016, with the Russian president, his spy chiefs, and senior ministers all present. They agreed a Trump White House would help secure Moscow's strategic objectives, among them social turmoil in the U.S. and a weakening of the American president's negotiating position. How could anyone be surprised by this? For all the people who say, David, you love to criticize Putin, Putin's brilliant. Putin's brilliant. Russia is brilliant at this. Of course, if you're Russia, you, China, and the U.S. are the three major superpowers vying for the next decade or two of supremacy among that group of three. What could do more damage to the United States than electing a cartoonish moron like Donald Trump? Russia's smart. I'm not criticizing. Of course they tried to do this. And unfortunately, the Republican electorate and subsequently enough of the electorate that voted in the general election fell for it, and Trump won. It doesn't mean Trump and Putin met to plan this. That's not how intelligence operations work. Russia's three spy agencies were ordered to find practical ways to support Trump in a decree appearing to bear Putin's signature. These are the documents believed to now be authenticated. By this point, Trump was the front runner in the Republican Party's nomination race. A report prepared by Putin's expert department recommended Moscow use all possible force to ensure a Trump victory. This is also relevant because those saying, well, Putin was involved even during the primary. Increasingly, it looks like Trump surfaced to the top of the Republican primary thanks just to the ignorance of the Republican electorate that votes in the primary. At that point at which it seemed that Trump was in the commanding position, that's when Russia got the idea, hey, it would be real. Imagine the laughingstock that the U.S. would be if Donald Trump defeated Hillary Clinton, whatever your thoughts are about Hillary Clinton. Western intelligence agencies are understood to have been aware of the documents for some months and to have carefully examined them. The papers seen by The Guardian seem to represent a serious and highly unusual leak from within the Kremlin. Let me propose something to you. OK, this is speculation. That's what we do. This is an opinion show. I want to just float an idea. There seems to be agreement that these documents are legitimate. And there seems to be agreement that this high level leak from the Kremlin is unusual. OK, I'm just going to float something here. Recently, Joe Biden and Vladimir Putin met. And as far as we believe earlier, even more recently, Joe Biden and Vladimir Putin spoke believed to be related to cyber attacks. I'm just asking, is it possible that part of the negotiation that took place was that on the one hand, Biden would resist a counterattack shutting down a Russian oil pipeline, and in exchange, some documents would leak from the Kremlin, which rarely happens, which would illuminate exactly this about Russia's preference and work to help Donald Trump. I don't know. And the really funny part about that is that there's this idea that Trumpists have about how you project power as a leader that comes from Trump's cartoonish nature. You push aside the Montenegrin president or prime minister, I believe president. And you talk in a certain way and you say certain things about Kim Jong-un and Putin and whatever. The real way that power actually works is you don't stomp around and scream like a child like Trump does. It's by direct, undisclosed calls where you say to a leader, hey, this is how it has to be. If you want this, then you have to do that. And it's just an idea because it is unusual that such documents would leak from the Kremlin. So is there anything surprising here? No, there really isn't. No, this is everything we believed and that made simply logical sense. That is what it is. Now, of course, not surprisingly, the Kremlin is responding dismissively. Putin's spokesman, Dmitry Peskov, says the idea that Russian leaders met and agreed to support Trump in early 2016 is a great pulp fiction. The report, number 3204 VD, is classified as secret. It says Trump is the most promising candidate from the Kremlin's point of view. There's a brief psychological assessment of Trump, who's described as an impulsive, mentally unstable, and unbalanced individual who suffers from an inferiority complex. There is also apparent confirmation that the Kremlin possesses compromat or potentially compromising material on Trump, collected, the document says, from Trump's earlier non-official visits to Russian Federation territory. The paper refers to certain events that happened during Trump's trips to Moscow. Security Council members are invited to find details in Appendix 5. At paragraph 5, the document states it's unclear what the appendix contains. It is acutely necessary to use all possible force to facilitate his election to the post of U.S. president. So nothing surprising. Of course, there are people who are going to say this is also part of the lie. But, you know, for me, this has always been, there's not going to be any smoking gun of Trump and Putin meeting. Anybody who's expecting that, anybody who was even expecting the Russia stuff to lead to Trump's removal, as you can go back to April of 2017, where I say that's the wrong expectation. That's not how it works. That's not what this is. But the clear motivation for Russia to make the U.S. a cartoonish laughingstock by helping Trump, it's obvious. It would be weird if Russia didn't do it because it's such an obvious intelligence opportunity. Many countries would think of it, but wouldn't have the know-how or the means to carry it out. Russia's really good at getting themselves involved in this stuff. That's the reality. Okay, one other similar story about new reporting that we have. Earlier this week, I told you about the forthcoming book, I Alone Can Fix It, by Washington Post reporters Carol Leonig and Philip Rucker. And during the week, there have been little leaks about what is in that book. There is now a New York Magazine report with more information about what's in it, and also some CNN reports. And what is in this book is absolutely and totally wild. Let's first look at some CNN published quotes from the book, starting with Donald Trump talking about the German Chancellor Angela Merkel. You know, Joe Biden today is meeting with Angela Merkel and will be doing a press conference with her. My sense is that Biden's perspective on Merkel is different than Trump's. Donald Trump reportedly said in the Oval Office, quote, "that bitch Merkel," as well as "I know the effing Krauts, and I was raised by the biggest Kraut of them all." Kraut, of course, a pejorative for German people. Trump reportedly referring to the chancellor as "that bitch Merkel." Also reported in this book, General Mark Milley was worried about how do we protect the inauguration. And Milley reportedly said, quote, "here's the deal, guys. These guys are Nazis. They're Boogaloo boys. They're Proud Boys. These are the same people we fought in World War II." And then lastly, from CNN's reporting on quotes from the book, I Alone Can Fix It, Nancy Pelosi reportedly saying of Trump after January 6th, "this guy's crazy. He's dangerous. He's a maniac. We have deep concerns." The New York Magazine report outlining that Mark Milley said Trump preached, quote, "the gospel of the Führer," referring to Adolf Hitler. General Mark Milley, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, likened Donald Trump's effort to hold on to power after the 2020 election to Adolf Hitler, saying the president was preaching the gospel of the Führer with his lies about the election being stolen, according to the book I Alone Can Fix It by Carol Leonig and Philip Rucker. The Pentagon's top general said shortly before the January 6th insurrection that Trump had led the country to the brink of its own Reichstag moment, viewing him as a potential threat to the American democracy. It seems very clear that Mark Milley, you know what's really funny about this? Was it last week or the week before that we had that clip of Mark Milley saying during a hearing, "Hey guys, listen, just because you learn about critical race theory doesn't mean you become some kind of cartoon woke character." In the same way that Mark Milley said, we are a university at the military and we want to learn about Marxism. We want to learn about communism. We want to learn about critical race theory. We want to understand what are the beliefs of people within the country and outside of it. It's quite clear, you know, whatever you want to think about Mark Milley, that the fact that he's a student of history has served him quite well in being able to look at the past and find situations that are analogous to what we saw under Donald Trump. The article points out Trump had appointed Milley to be chairman of the Joint Chiefs in 2018 over the objection of Defense Secretary James Mattis. The Army general's tenure at the top of the Pentagon had been relatively quiet until last summer, when he appeared in uniform during an infamous photo op for Trump in Lafayette Square that followed the clearing of protesters in front of the White House. Milley apologized for creating a perception of the military involved in domestic politics. Although the book chronicles Milley's concerns with Trump dating back to that moment, the general's worries grew rapidly as Trump plunged the nation into chaos following Election Day. 7 days later, Milley got a call from, quote, an old friend with an explicit warning that Trump and his allies were trying to overturn the government. Milley was confident that any attempts by Trump to hold on to power would be thwarted because the military wouldn't go along. They may try, but they're not going to effing succeed, he told aides. You can't do this without the military. You can't do this without the CIA and FBI. We're the guys with the guns. Still, Milley was disturbed by the sight of Trump supporters rallying to his cause in November, calling them brown shirts in the streets. Leonig and Rucker wrote that Milley, quote, believed Trump was stoking unrest, possibly in hopes of an excuse to invoke the Insurrection Act and call out the military. Even at that high level, there was the fear that that's what Donald Trump wanted to do. A key difference between Trump's dictatorial delusions and those of Adolf Hitler: Trump is in his mid-70s. Hitler was in his 40s when the Reichstag burned. Trump could still get a good run if he were reelected in 24, right? But it is a different situation in that sense, significantly different age. I actually am looking forward to this book, I Alone Can Fix It. Normally, I'm not big on these books, but this one I do plan to read. Listen, today's voicemail kind of bums me out. It's about Cuba. And we talk sometimes about the revolutionary left. It's a sort of pseudo-populism on the left, which sometimes blinds people to authoritarianism and the lack of progressivism in authoritarianism, where they end up supporting these, often military uniform wearing faux populists. And I've been talking this week about how the U.S. has some blame for the situation in Cuba, thanks to the hypocritical and counterproductive U.S. embargo of Cuba. I want the embargo to be dropped. I don't want American involvement in Cuban politics. And yet, I cannot, as a progressive, support something as authoritarian as the Castro regime, which came to power in 1959, handed power from brother to brother in 2008. That's not progressive. That's just not progressive. And sadly, I did get a voicemail. It's very long. I'll only play some of it, from a revolutionary leftist who doesn't like my perspective. Take a listen.
David, I'm really disappointed in you, the way you're framing Cuba politically. You are purposefully leaving out the full context. Fidel Castro did not start out as a dictator, nor a dictator wannabe.
So, first of all, didn't start out as a dictator, conceding that that's eventually what he became. Okay.
He was a reaction to the Batista regime, friendly to the United States corporate industrial oligarchy.
Sure.
The people in Cuba uprose because they were sick and tired of being paid lousy wages.
Sure.
They didn't want to be serfs for the American industrial machine. Okay? Fidel Castro, I believe he was educated in the United States. And so he had a little bit one-up on his fellow Cubans. And he made sure that they understood the true nature of what was going on.
Listen, this is how faux populist authoritarians work. The fact that Castro came to power in a context where there was genuine, real, in the streets dissatisfaction with Cuban leadership doesn't change the fact that this is how faux populism works. It's the populist rhetoric, and next thing you know, the same guys in power for 49 years with a police state with complete and total control over every aspect of the people and of the economy. The fact that Castro replaced something bad and that those who were protesting in the 50s in Cuba did so genuinely and for good reasons doesn't mean that we praise Fidel Castro, in power since 1959 until 2008, at which point he hands power to his brother. It's not progressive. I can't support it. And this is, it's a very similar playbook to Venezuela. because in the 50s there were reasons to protest doesn't mean we now don't criticize what is an authoritarian regime. Even the military uniforms, similar between, the Castro green uniform and Hugo Chavez and Nicolas Maduro in Venezuela appearing sometimes in essentially military dress uniforms. And it's sort of disturbing to me that supposed progressives not only fall for the faux populist rhetoric, but they even fall for even the military uniform stuff doesn't raise alarms to you. The suspicion that these folks have of the military uniform when it's the US or the UK military seems to go out the window when you see the same sort of stuff being done in Cuba and in Venezuela. I will never get it. And again, at this point, I've done this so many times. When I do these political compass type tests, I am not an authoritarian leftist. I'm a small L libertarian leftist. So I can't, as a progressive, support authoritarian regimes. And it makes me sad when people who sometimes think of themselves as progressive support that. It's just disappointing. We have a great bonus show for you today. Sign up at joinpakman.com. We'll see you then.